He wore gold like armor. He smiled like a god. But behind the palace walls, Carinus was not a ruler. He was a hunger with a crown. Rome had seen cruel emperors before. It had seen madmen, monsters, and tyrants. But Carinus was something else entirely. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing pleasure, unashamed, unstoppable. And in his wake, he left behind broken marriages, shattered honor, and the silence of men too afraid to speak. He married 9 women, not out of love, but out of lust. And that was just the beginning. He didn't care whose wife she was, a general's, a senator's, a soldier's. It didn't matter. If Carinus wanted her, she was taken. And when he was done, he sent her back, bruised, humiliated, used. Rome whispered, the army boiled, and the emperor laughed. This is the story of the most hedonistic ruler to ever sit on the Roman throne. A man whose appetite was bigger than his empire. A man who thought he could take whatever he wanted until the empire took everything from him. You've heard of Nero. You've heard of Caligula. But Carinus? He makes them look polite. So if you're ready to hear how power turns to poison, how love becomes a weapon, and how a throne built on lust eventually burns, stay with me. This is not just history. This is a warning. When Carinus was born, he wasn't meant to wear a crown soaked in wine and lust. But fate, or perhaps something darker, had other plans for him. And from the moment he opened his eyes, the world around him began to change. Not through great wars or grand ideas, but through soft silk sheets, whispered laughter in the dark, and a hunger that could never be filled. He was the son of the emperor Carinus, raised in privilege, wealth, and comfort. But Carinus didn't grow into a man shaped by discipline or duty. Instead, he grew like a vine fed only by desire, curling around everything he touched, wrapping his fingers around power, not to protect it, but to twist it into something that pleased him. And Rome, the eternal city, watched silently as the boy who loved games more than books and pleasure more than honor, rose steadily through the ranks not by earning respect, but by being born into it. And when Carinus became emperor, he appointed his son as ruler over the western half of the empire, trusting him not because he was ready, but because he was blood. But blood, as Rome would learn, was a poor replacement for wisdom. With the empire split between Carinus, and his brother Numerian, there was hope that strength might be shared. That one brother would hold the sword while the other carried the scroll. But Carinus had no interest in swords, scrolls, or soldiers unless they bowed at his feet or brought him something or someone that could entertain him for the night. And once his father left for war in the east, Carinus took his crown not as a burden, but as a key to every locked door in Rome. And the doors opened eagerly, especially the ones that led to luxury, to music, to perfume and painted faces, to wine-drenched banquets where senators passed out beneath golden tables while dancers moved like smoke through columns lit by torchlight. The emperor didn't sit on a throne. He lounged on it, draped in colored robes, surrounded by lovers, laughing as if the world outside his palace walls wasn't burning at the edges. And he didn't care if it was, because Carinus had discovered something more powerful than the sword: indulgence, the kind that makes men forget who they are. And he married not once, not twice, but 9 times. Each wedding grander than the last, each wife discarded like a piece of clothing once he grew tired of her scent or her silence. And the people began to whisper, first with curiosity, then with disgust, as the emperor's court became a playground for his fantasies, a stage for his pleasure, and the wives of senators, nobles, and soldiers began to disappear into his palace, returning days or weeks later with hollow eyes and stories they could never tell. It was said that Carinus didn't just take lovers, he took what he wanted when he wanted, and if a man protested, he found himself reassigned to a far frontier or worse, made to watch as the emperor reached for the hand of the woman he called his own. Fear spread quietly, not because Carinus ruled with violence, he didn't have to, but because he ruled with desire. And there is nothing more dangerous than a man who believes his pleasure is sacred, who believes the empire itself was made to serve his appetite. And as the months passed, Rome began to change. Laws were ignored, temples left empty, coins stamped with his grinning face instead of the gods, and the soldiers, those who once bled for the empire, now watched their wives avoid the palace gates, praying that the emperor's eyes would never settle on them during one of his parades through the city. Parades not of triumph, but of decadence, with Carinus riding in golden chariots surrounded by musicians, actors, dancers, and wives dressed not in armor or modest robes, but in costumes made of silver threads and nothing else. It was not Rome they were marching through. It was something else, something hollow and glittering and terrifying. And yet no one stopped him, because Carinus didn't break rules, he simply ignored them, and those who questioned him either vanished or were drowned in gifts until they learned to smile. And somewhere beneath all the pleasure, all the marriages, all the nights spent laughing while the empire creaked under the weight of war and rebellion, there was a boy who had never been told no, a boy who believed Rome was his to kiss, to break, to burn if it made him smile. And as the fires of his reign began to flicker higher, no one yet knew just how deep the damage would go, or how much blood would be spilled not in battlefields but behind velvet curtains, in the name of a crown that had become a collar of gold, pleasure, and silence. Carinus didn't rule like an emperor. He ruled like a god of appetite, and every day that passed under his power felt more like a fever dream than a reign, because now the line between pleasure and punishment was gone, and the Roman court, once a place of strategy and state, had become something else entirely, something closer to a masquerade soaked in wine and fear, where politics were whispered in bedrooms and favors were granted in exchange for silence. And as the emperor's hunger deepened, so did the darkness of his pleasures, because it wasn't enough to marry 9 times. It wasn't enough to throw lavish orgies in the palace gardens, where slaves served naked and dancers bled their feet raw for the sake of his amusement. No, now Carinus began to look beyond his golden gates to the people sworn to serve him, especially his soldiers, especially their wives, because something in him wanted not just love but dominance, the kind that left others broken, and it became common, too common, for wives to be summoned to the palace under the pretense of honor or reward, only to return with empty eyes and silence that said more than words ever could, and their husbands, bound by duty or fear or a desperate belief in the empire, would swallow their rage and kneel the next morning like nothing had happened. And Carinus smiled through it all, draped in robes that shimmered with imported gems, his face powdered and his lips painted, his fingers adorned with rings he had stolen from the hands of women he had shamed. And if anyone dared resist, if any man thought his marriage sacred or his wife off limits, Carinus responded not with rage but with mockery, sending the man to rot in some forgotten post in the far provinces, or worse, inviting him to watch the next banquet, where his wife was made to pour wine dressed in almost nothing, her eyes never meeting his, her dignity shattered in front of all of Rome's nobility. The cruelty was not just in the act, but in the joy Carinus took from it, the twisted power of knowing no one could stop him. And the court, once filled with senators and advisors, was now a rotating cast of actors, musicians, jugglers, and those desperate for favor. All of them smiling too wide, laughing too loud, never knowing whether they'd be offered a feast or fed to the wolves. And yet through it all, Carinus remained untouched, as if the world outside his palace no longer existed, as if the borders weren't weakening, the eastern front not trembling, the people not starving, because in his world there was only pleasure, only his reflection in golden mirrors, only the next conquest to seduce or humiliate. And he began hosting new kinds of games, not the gladiator fights of old, but private spectacles behind locked doors where the price of admission was submission, and where senators' daughters danced for coins that once bore the faces of gods. And in those halls, filled with music and sweat and the scent of crushed flowers and burning oil, something inside the empire began to crack, not loudly, not all at once, but slowly like a wine cup held too tight in trembling hands. And though the people didn't speak of it publicly, they began to avoid the palace at night, began to clutch their loved ones tighter, began to pray not just to Jupiter, but to anything that would listen. And the soldiers, the very ones who once lifted Carinus into power, now spoke in low voices in the barracks, eyes narrowed, wondering if the man they followed was still an emperor or just a beast wearing a crown. And still Carinus danced through the gardens, unbothered, his laughter echoing through marble halls as another marriage was announced. Another woman paraded through the city in wedding veils before vanishing into the shadows of his chambers. And Rome, ancient, proud Rome, watched as its soul was sold off piece by piece, not to an enemy army, but to a man who believed the empire owed him everything, including its daughters, its loyalty, its silence. And as torches burned in the palace, night after night, and the screams behind silk curtains grew louder, no one yet knew how much longer the city could hold its breath before it broke apart entirely beneath the weight of one man's unstoppable hunger. Carinus had stopped pretending there were rules because now his palace was not just a seat of power. It was a stage, and he the star of every show, and Rome no longer had a Caesar who led armies or passed laws, but an actor draped in silver and wine who shifted from one mask to the next depending on who was watching, and while the Senate sat in silence, stripped of purpose, and generals fought and died on distant borders, the emperor held costume feasts where he appeared dressed as gods, goddesses, or sometimes both, his body painted with gold leaf, his eyes blackened with coal, his robes sewn so sheer they whispered like smoke against his skin. And at these feasts the food was unnatural. Black grapes soaked in honeyed blood, meats shaped into obscene forms, desserts filled with gold dust and narcotics. And the guests were expected to laugh, to clap, to beg for more, even as their stomachs turned and their dignity withered. And Carinus watched it all from a throne shaped like a coiled snake, petting white peacocks, sipping from cups carved from skulls, his voice soft and melodic as he told riddles that made no sense, and jokes that were only funny if you feared for your life, because the emperor didn't want obedience anymore. He wanted worship, adoration, awe, the kind of attention given to gods or lunatics, and so he blurred every line he could find, calling himself divine, declaring his own birthdays, national holidays, placing his image above the altars of real gods. And yet somehow, this wasn't the strangest part, because what truly unsettled Rome was not what he wore, or who he touched, or how he partied, but how he could lie without blinking, smile without meaning it, and change his face to whatever the crowd wanted, until no one, not his guards, not his lovers, not his enemies, could tell who Carinus truly was, or if anything inside him was still real. And the people began to say in whispered tones that he had no soul anymore, just masks stacked one upon another, and beneath them, only hunger. And so while the empire crumbled at the edges, the north rioting, the east burning, the economy leaking like a wounded beast, Carinus remained unmoved, performing nightly plays where senators were made to act as servants, generals forced to dress as jesters, and women were auctioned as if they were rare paintings, and no one knew whether it was satire, cruelty, or madness, because to Carinus it was all the same. And when someone asked him once what it meant to rule, he didn't speak of law or justice, but simply answered, "It means never having to be bored." And that became the motto of his court, where games replaced governance, where truth was punished and flattery rewarded, and every voice that dared speak of honor was drowned in music and laughter and clapping hands that shook with fear. And yet even the clapping began to slow, because outside the palace, the people had begun to starve, the treasury nearly empty, the fields neglected, the legions unpaid. And still, Carinus spent throwing golden coins from balconies during his processions, ordering entire gardens be torn up and replaced with marble stages where actors reenacted his fake victories in battles he never fought. And Rome, once the heart of the world, now pulsed with unease, because it had become clear that their emperor did not believe in the empire at all, only in himself, in the mirror, in the sound of his own name whispered in reverence or terror. And every time a soldier marched beneath his balcony, he looked not with pride but with suspicion, wondering which sword might be sharpened next, which uniform might one day step out of line, because Carinus knew, deep down, that even empires built on fear eventually collapse under their own silence. But instead of stopping, instead of listening, instead of leading, he chose to throw another feast, light another fire, marry another wife, or someone else's. And the city watched as if hypnotized as their emperor spun faster and faster in a whirlwind of masks and music, and the question grew louder in everyone's mind. How long could a man pretend to be a god before the gods came calling? Carinus had many wives, too many for most to count, and he paraded each one through Rome like a prize won in a bloody game. But no one knew where the old wives went once a new one appeared in the emperor's arms, because none were ever seen again, and whispers crept like ivy through the streets, that the wives weren't divorced or exiled, but buried beneath the palace gardens, their graves covered with roses and lies, and Carinus never denied it. He simply laughed when asked, leaned in close and said, "Some things are better forgotten." before kissing the next woman on the lips in front of a crowd that no longer cheered, only watched with wide, exhausted eyes because these weren't marriages for love or alliance or politics. They were declarations of power, trophies for a man who wanted to possess everything that moved. And he didn't just wed noble women, but daughters of senators, the wives of generals, actresses, priestesses, virgins taken from sacred temples, and even a slave girl he claimed was more royal than Rome itself. And each one he lavished with gifts and attention until he tired of her. And then, silence, disappearance, a rumor too dark to repeat in daylight. And those close to the court began to understand that marriage to Carinus was a sentence, not a blessing, a game of survival wrapped in silk and gold. And some women tried to run, but there was no escape from a man who believed the empire was his bedroom, and every person in it his to use, break, and discard. And so when he found out one of his wives had dared to write to her former husband in secret, Carinus had the man's tongue cut out and sewn into the folds of her wedding dress, then made her wear it to the next feast while musicians played and guests pretended not to see the blood on her sleeves. And after that, no wife ever dared whisper a word of longing again. And yet he was never satisfied. Each conquest made him hungrier. Each pleasure faded too quickly. And so he began to seek out the forbidden, the cruel, the twisted pleasures that only fear could buy. And one night, drunk on wine and rage, he demanded that every married soldier in the palace parade their wives before him like livestock. And he stood at the top of a staircase, pointing, that one and that one and that one. And the chosen women were taken into his chambers, while their husbands stood motionless outside, hands clenched, eyes lowered, hearts broken in a silence too heavy to bear. And when the emperor returned the women days later, he laughed and said, "You may have them back, but they're not the same." And they weren't, because something had changed in their eyes, something hollow and burning, something that would never fully heal. And still the soldiers obeyed, because speaking out meant death. And Carinus made sure they all understood that their loyalty was measured not just in swords, but in silence, in shame, in surrender. And Rome itself began to sink beneath the weight of it as more and more people looked away, choosing to forget what they had seen, what they had heard, what they now knew their emperor truly was. And still Carinus smiled, married again, perhaps for the 7th or 8th time. No one could remember, not even the scribes who kept the records, because he erased their names from the books once they were gone, replaced them with poems about beauty and power and obedience. And as the sun rose over the city, casting golden light on crumbling marble and empty homes, the people whispered that their emperor did not love women. He devoured them, that every marriage was a funeral dressed in white, and that one day someone would have to stop him, but not yet, because fear was stronger than outrage, and every wife who vanished proved just how much Rome was willing to lose to keep pretending that nothing was wrong. Rome had seen terrible emperors before, tyrants who burned cities, madmen who named their horses as consuls, and rulers who drowned the empire in blood. But with Carinus, it was different, because his evil didn't shout. It smiled, it charmed, it kissed your hand while taking your soul. And the city for a long time looked away, because it was easier to bow than to resist, easier to cheer than to scream. And so the temples stayed open, the streets stayed busy, and the games in the arena grew louder, masking the rot that festered behind palace doors. And Carinus kept playing his part, throwing coins to the crowd with one hand, while dragging someone's wife into the shadows with the other. And the people kept clapping, kept laughing, because fear had taught them that silence was survival. And to speak against the emperor was to vanish, just like the senators who tried to write laws he didn't like. Men who once sat proudly in the Forum, now found floating in the Tiber, their mouths stuffed with rose petals as a warning that beauty would not protect you, not in this Rome, not under this man. And those who lived close to the palace said you could hear weeping at night, soft and steady like music carried by the wind. But no one ever dared to ask who it came from, because everyone already knew. And Carinus, with his golden robes and perfume that clung like smoke, acted like a god, one who demanded worship not in temples, but in obedience. And he walked through the halls of power as if he owned time itself, stopping only to admire his own reflection, or to insult a servant just to watch them flinch. And the city adjusted, twisted itself around his cruelty, until the bazaar became normal. soldiers guarding their wives like treasure, senators bringing their daughters to court and praying he wouldn't notice them, shopkeepers hanging images of Carinus over their doors like protection spells, hoping the emperor would pass by without stepping inside. And still, he kept marrying, kept taking what wasn't his, like a sickness that moved from house to house, a hunger that could never be filled, and his court grew stranger, filled with actors, dancers, flatterers, men with painted faces, and women who dared not speak, all kept close so he could feed on praise and lust and lies. And those who tried to escape, a noble woman who fled Rome, a general who refused an invitation to the palace, were hunted, dragged back, punished in ways that were never written down, only whispered about. And still no one stopped him, because to stop him would mean looking directly into the face of Rome's failure, of how far the empire had fallen, of what kind of man now wore the crown. And so the plays continued. The parades grew louder, and the palace glowed brighter each night, even as the soul of the city darkened, and Carinus, ever smiling, would sit on his marble throne beneath silk canopies and whisper to his latest wife, or victim, that Rome loved him, that he was adored, that he was eternal. And she would nod, broken and hollow, because she knew the truth that everyone in Rome carried but no one dared say, that this empire so proud, so ancient, so powerful, had been conquered not by an army, not by a rival, but by one man's appetite, and it was dying not from war, but from silence. And as Carinus raised his wineglass and laughed at a joke no one made, the city prayed, not for justice, not for vengeance, but for someone, anyone, to wake from this nightmare and say the word that had not been spoken in years. Enough. As Rome baked under the brutal summer sun, Emperor Carinus announced a grand celebration, not for war victories or divine blessings, but simply because he could, because desire burned in his veins hotter than the August heat, and because the empire had become his playground of pleasures. He called it the Festival of Flesh, a week-long event held in the palace gardens and arenas, where senators were forced to attend in robes of purple and gold, where slaves bathed in wine, and where statues of the gods were draped in sheer fabrics, as if to make them blush. Carinus entered the garden each night like a god himself, his chest glistening with oils, a crown of roses on his head, and behind him a procession of women and men, courtesans, musicians, dancers, and defeated generals whose families had been taken and returned broken. He didn't ride in on horseback or chariot, but reclined on a platform carried by 6 shirtless soldiers whose wives he had dishonored, their eyes hollow as they held him up like Atlas, bearing not the sky, but the weight of shame. The festival was not just about indulgence. It was a theater of humiliation, where Roman nobility were made to crawl, where judges served as wine pourers, and where the wives of tribunes were summoned by name, dressed in translucent silk, and asked to sit beside the emperor's dais, only to be dismissed with a kiss on the hand and a laugh that echoed like mockery. Carinus had built an altar to his own body, a marble stage where he would lay surrounded by 9 women he called his queens, one for each of his marriages, though he often forgot their names and instead numbered them, 1st through 9th, replacing them as easily as sandals when they no longer pleased him. In one infamous moment during the 4th night, he stood before a crowd of thousands and asked who among them believed their wives had remained untouched during his reign. Only silence answered, and he smiled, raising his cup as if to toast their pain. He had the arrogance of a man who believed the gods envied him, and the cruelty of one who never feared retribution, and each night the festival grew darker. Mock executions turned real. Jesters whipped for failing to amuse him. Noblewomen made to perform dances they had never learned, their feet bleeding on stone floors as Carinus clapped with a child's delight. The people of Rome, once quick to cheer their emperors, now whispered behind closed doors, their laughter nervous, their prayers frequent, their hope fading like candlelight in a storm. He rewrote the laws of modesty for the occasion. Nudity became normal. Devotion was measured in obedience, and dignity was currency no longer accepted in the palace walls. And still the emperor drank and laughed and moaned through the nights, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with kohl, his throne replaced by a cushioned bed where he received tributes not in gold, but in skin. Behind all of this spectacle, Carinus continued to reward silence and punish dissent, his spies watching the crowd for lowered eyes or flinching mouths, and if one was found guilty of disapproval, they were made an example, stripped, painted in red, and tied to the gates like living warnings labeled traitors to pleasure. Even his generals were not spared humiliation. He accused one of hiding a beautiful wife, and when she was found and brought before him, he paraded her through the garden on a silver leash, then returned her in silence, her face pale and blank, her husband never speaking again. The festival became legend before it had even ended, a nightmare masquerading as celebration, and by the seventh day the city stank of wine, sweat, incense, and decay. The palace floors were slick with spilled oil and shame, the fountains clogged with flower petals and broken sandals, and somewhere deep inside the emperor's private chambers, Carinus danced alone, naked and delirious, a crown tilted on his head, whispering to himself about immortality. He believed that as long as Rome watched him, feared him, spoke his name, he would never die. He carved that belief into the very walls of his estate, in mosaics and murals that showed him not as a man, but as a god of excess, surrounded by weeping angels and blindfolded mortals. Yet even among the chaos, a shadow had begun to creep, a quiet rebellion in the hearts of those who had been broken and returned, who now smiled too politely, bowed too deeply, and waited too patiently. But Carinus didn't see it. He saw only beauty, power, lust, and his own reflection in polished marble floors, where he kissed his own image and whispered, "I am Rome." But Rome by now had grown sick of his touch, and the empire he thought was kneeling was beginning to stand. The festival had ended, but its stench lingered in the air like rot beneath a perfume, sweet on the surface, sour underneath, because though the fountains were drained and the silk was stripped from the statues, the empire still pulsed with the bruises left behind by its emperor. Carinus, believing himself more adored than ever, wandered the marble halls humming songs no one else remembered, wrapped in robes that trailed like smoke, his lips stained red from wine or kisses, or perhaps both, never questioning the quiet that now followed his footsteps, never wondering why servants no longer laughed at his jokes, or why the wives of his generals avoided his gaze with frozen smiles. He believed the silence was reverence, when in truth it was resentment, a growing, tightening hatred that coiled in the hearts of soldiers, statesmen, even slaves, each of them counting their wounds, their losses, the names of the women they had never gotten back, or gotten back hollowed and changed. The Senate, once dismissed as an audience to his indulgences, now met in hushed corners and coded language, their loyalty rotting faster than the roses that still lay dried in the palace garden. And even the Praetorian Guard, long treated like Carinus's private pets, fed with gold, flattered with titles, poisoned with pleasure, began to shift, their eyes turning colder each time they escorted another weeping wife from the emperor's chamber. No one dared confront him directly, of course. Not yet, for Carinus still ruled with the unpredictable hand of a storm, gifting treasure to a stranger one day, then executing a general's son for a joke he didn't like the next, and always watching, always whispering, always demanding tribute in the form of obedience or bodies. He could still summon a crowd if he promised a spectacle, still draw gasps when he stood bare-chested beneath the colonnades, comparing his skin to the marble, still cause nervous laughter when he claimed the gods had made him beautiful so that mortals would suffer. But the empire had begun to look past the illusion, past the painted face and perfumed hair, past the feasts and weddings and whispered vows to goddesses no one prayed to anymore. And now it saw what had always been there. A man who thought cruelty was charm, who confused lust with loyalty, who believed fear was the same as love. Out in the provinces, governors who once sent gifts now sent warnings. Border towns were slipping, grain shipments had slowed, local militias were rising, and even the wolves that howled outside the city seemed bolder at night, as though the land itself knew that the emperor was weak. Still, Carinus laughed in the face of decay, declaring every sign of rebellion a test of his divinity, claiming he was being shaped by the gods into something greater, something eternal, something no sword could touch. He ordered more statues built, bigger than the last, some nude, some winged, one so massive it required slaves to die under its weight as it was lifted into place. And when it cracked after a rainstorm, he had the architect executed for insulting the emperor's perfection. He married again, his ninth wife in as many years, this time a young noblewoman from a distant city whose father offered her in exchange for tax forgiveness, and Carinus accepted with a grin, calling it diplomacy of the flesh, a phrase that made even his closest advisors stare at their sandals. He held another ceremony, quieter this time, though no less grotesque. Servants dressed as animals, fountains that ran with milk. The bride herself veiled so completely that some guests whispered she had been drugged, or worse, replaced. By now, the people of Rome had stopped writing down his decrees in stone, afraid they'd soon be erased, and even his most loyal sculptors began to hide initials in his likenesses, as if to separate their hands from the horror they carved. But Carinus, in his silk-wrapped world of mirrors and moaning pleasure, saw only what he wished to see: an empire still on its knees, an audience still clapping, a world still hungry for him. He took to calling himself the Son of Rome and insisted that senators refer to him not as princeps, but as illumination incarnate, a title they repeated through gritted teeth as he smeared sacred oils across his chest during council meetings and asked them to compare him to Apollo, not in skill, but in skin. The madness was no longer just behind closed doors. It bled into the laws, the taxes, the temples, the military itself, where veterans whispered stories of a time before Carinus, a time when Rome bled for glory, not for spectacle. And somewhere in the shadows that whisper began to take shape. Not just a murmur of disgust, but a plan. The slow sharpening of a blade, the quiet drawing of lines, the gathering of those whose wives had been ruined, whose names had been blackened, whose loyalty had been mocked and spit on. But still the emperor danced. Still he drank. Still he smiled like a boy untouched by consequence. Still he bathed in wine and called it worship. Still he kissed his reflection and called it prophecy. And still he ruled, believing always that no matter how deep the cracks grew in the empire, no matter how bitter the people became, no matter how loud the knives whispered behind the curtains, he would always be adored. Because in his mind, he wasn't just the emperor. He was the desire of Rome made flesh, and no one, he believed, could ever say no to desire. By the time the leaves began to fall and the night stretched longer across Rome, the illusion of Carinus's power had grown thin, like silk stretched over a blade, beautiful but fragile, unable to hide the sharp edges underneath. And while he still paraded through the city with jewels around his wrists and laughter on his lips, claiming he was the favorite of every god and the husband of every virtue, the truth began creeping through the cracks of the empire like a slow poison. He could no longer walk through the streets without the crowd thinning behind him, no longer give a speech without eyes darting, no longer seduce without being met with whispers that echoed after the doors closed, and even his guards, once intoxicated by his charm and gold, began to shift their weight uneasily when his hand brushed too long on their shoulders or his jokes cut too deep into honor. Rome had stopped loving him, but Carinus was too drunk on himself to notice. He thought the quiet was reverence, the stares were awe, the disobedience was merely play, and so he tightened his grip, not on policy or justice, but on spectacle, flooding the city with new parades, new marriages, new statues so enormous they blotted the sun in the Forum, each one more grotesque than the last, with his chest bared and mouth open in mid-moan, carved in a pose that made even the stonemasons wince. His ninth wife disappeared after only 6 weeks, replaced by a foreign dancer who barely spoke Latin, and when asked where the last empress had gone, Carinus laughed and said she had melted from pleasure, a phrase that circulated through the bathhouses like a curse, until no one could speak it without spitting. Meanwhile, the provinces trembled under neglect. Grain shipments grew thinner, border patrols missed their rotations, and legions sent letters with fewer titles and more warnings. Their loyalty tested against the weight of humiliation. The Senate, which Carinus now treated as a decorative audience, was no longer silent out of fear, but frozen in calculation, weighing not whether he should fall but when, and whether their hands would be clean if someone else made the first cut. Carinus remained unaware, or unwilling to be aware, as he wandered deeper into delusion, declaring that the gods had shown him visions of a divine womb hidden inside his body, that he was destined to birth a golden age through his ecstasy, that his kisses could heal sickness, and his tears could end war. And while the city choked on laughter it dared not voice, he continued to build his fantasy, converting a temple into a private theater where he played all the roles himself, from virgin bride to triumphant general, dressing in feathers and crimson veils, performing alone or in front of imported slaves, paid to weep and applaud on cue. But beneath the gold and incense, beneath the lace-covered doors of the palace, something old and Roman had begun to stir. Disgust, not of his desires, but of his indifference to pain, of the bodies he left behind, the marriages he shattered, the loyalty he abused, the wives of his soldiers who had been handed back like used scrolls, were now speaking in secret to their husbands, not weeping anymore, but seething. Their shame turned into a cold, steady rage that no feast could distract from. In the barracks, centurions sharpened their swords slower, with more purpose, staring not at the stone, but at the future, wondering what Rome could become if it simply changed course. And Carinus, in his pleasure palace of mirrors, continued to rehearse his favorite scene, a coronation of himself as both emperor and divine consort, crowned not with laurel but with a wreath of roses and serpents, announcing that he would no longer take mortal lovers because only gods were worthy of him. He stood naked in candlelight and whispered marriage vows to his reflection, while musicians played funeral dirges dressed in wedding gowns, believing fully that Rome itself was his bride and would never leave him, no matter how many times he insulted her. But Rome was already walking away, her footsteps muffled by the sound of drums in the north where rebellion stirred. Not a chaotic riot, but a cold-blooded correction, led by a man whose name had not yet been spoken aloud, but whose presence was beginning to take shape in letters passed hand to hand among senators, among soldiers, among slaves. Rumors bloomed like rot in the palace garden. Some said Carinus was planning to name his next lover co-emperor. Others whispered that he had begun sacrificing animals bearing the faces of former generals carved into mass. Still others claimed he was building a new throne carved entirely from bones and silver, declaring that only those who had suffered deserved to kneel before him. The truth mattered less than the feeling, and the feeling was this. Rome had had enough, and Carinus, for all his beauty and confidence, for all his performances and declarations of divine touch, had begun to stink of something worse than sin, weakness. Even Julia, the last of his advisors with any shred of affection for him, began to send messages behind his back, reminding forgotten friends that Rome once stood for something, anything, other than this daily theater of flesh and pride. And all the while, Carinus kept smiling, kept singing, kept kissing his fingertips and blowing them toward the stars, convinced that if he only danced brightly enough, if he laughed just a little louder, no blade could ever reach him, not realizing that the hand holding the knife was already inside the palace, already watching him rehearse his next wedding, already nodding along when he asked, "Doesn't the emperor deserve to be loved?" It was just before dawn when the curtain finally began to fall on the mad reign of Emperor Carinus, and while the city still slept under blankets of fog and hangover, the palace glowed with soft candlelight as if nothing had changed, as if the man inside wasn't already marked for death by those who once kissed his hand and called him divine. And as Carinus stood before a mirror, applying gold dust to his cheekbones and curling his hair with the hands of a practiced performer, he hummed a song no one else remembered, the kind of lullaby whispered to children before gods were invented. And behind him, the servants moved silently, their eyes lowered, their mouths tight, their footsteps careful, for they had heard the rumors. This was to be his final masquerade, the last grand celebration before the world changed, the end of a show that had gone on too long, and Carinus, ever blind to truth but brilliant in illusion, planned to host it like he always had, in excess, in silk, in a haze of perfume so thick you couldn't smell the rot beneath the velvet. The courtyard was transformed into a temple of sin, with white roses painted red with dye, torches burning from bowls shaped like mouths, music echoing from instruments carved to look like human bones. And in the center stood Carinus, dressed in a gown sewn from 9 wedding veils, one for each wife he had discarded, his arms painted in gold, his bare chest glistening with oil, and around his neck a chain made from the rings of every soldier's wife he had ever seduced and sent home in shame. He raised his cup and toasted to eternity, to beauty, to himself, and the crowd, handpicked, drugged, terrified, clapped with shaking fingers, pretending not to notice the line of Praetorian guards standing too still, too silent, their hands resting too casually on hilts that had already drawn blood in secret. Carinus danced with a slave boy dressed as Mars, then switched partners with a eunuch dressed as Venus, spinning in circles beneath the stars as though war and love were the same. And when he threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoed across the courtyard like a prophecy already broken, because no one was really watching anymore. Not in the way he craved, not with hunger or awe, only patience, cold and sharpened. As the night burned on, he grew more erratic, spilling wine across his chest, licking it off his fingers, demanding that his generals kneel and call him goddess of victory, pulling a senator's son into his lap and declaring that he would marry him tomorrow, and if the stars objected, he would whip the heavens into obedience. But still no one stopped him, and Carinus mistook their stillness for worship, unaware that it was the same silence given to a dying animal, the kind spared from screams. At midnight, the music stopped, not by command, but by quiet agreement, and Carinus, confused but undeterred, clapped his hands and shouted for the next song, only to be met by a voice he didn't recognize, low and final, saying simply, "The performance is over." He turned, eyes wild, mouth forming a laugh that never came, as the first blade cut through the air and into his shoulder, then another into his thigh, and then the crowd moved, not toward him, but away quickly, fearfully, as if the very air had changed, as if to witness his death was to risk being touched by it. Carinus stumbled backward, bleeding, confused, betrayed, calling out names, reaching for hands that would not take his, falling to his knees beneath a statue of himself, dressed as Apollo, the irony too cruel for fate alone. And when he tried to crawl toward the altar to beg forgiveness from the gods he had so often claimed to embody, he was met instead by the boot of the captain of the guard, who pressed him down and whispered, "Rome says no," before the final thrust ended the reign of a man who had once thought he could make even history bend to his desires. They did not bury him, for he had desecrated too many graves with his laughter. They burned his body in the back garden and scattered the ashes into the Tiber River, the same way he had discarded every woman he dishonored, every soldier he humiliated, every tradition he shattered. And in the days that followed, the palace was stripped of his statues, his paintings burned, his name scratched from marble with chisels that cut deeper than stone, and Rome began to breathe again. But the air was not fresh, only less heavy, and in the quiet corners of the city, people whispered of the emperor who ruled like a god and died like a clown, the man who dressed his cruelty in silk and called it love, who turned pleasure into pain and power into theater. And though they tried to erase him, his legacy clung to Rome like a stain you couldn't scrub clean. Because Carinus had not just broken laws, he had broken dignity. And once that was gone, everything else cracked with it. He was not remembered with respect or hatred, but with unease, the kind that lives in the back of your throat when you pass a place where something awful happened. And though he ruled for only a few years, they called it an age of shadows, of shame, of spectacle. And even centuries later, his name still made historians pause, made poets grimace, made emperors glance behind them when they wore too much gold. Carinus was gone, but the mask he wore, of beauty, of power, of desire unchecked, still lingered in the air, like perfume over blood, like a ghost at a masquerade that never really ended. After Carinus was killed, Rome did not erupt in celebration or mourning. It simply exhaled, as if relieved that a fever had finally broken. And yet, even with the tyrant gone, and the palace cleaned of wine stains and perfume, something deeper remained, something colder, something the city could not wash away, for the memory of Carinus had stained not just marble, but the Roman soul itself. They said his spirit did not leave Rome easily, that even after his ashes were dumped into the Tiber like sewer waste, the gardens still smelled faintly of the oils he bathed in, the palace mirrors fogged for no reason, and the birds that once sang in the courtyards no longer returned, as if nature itself had turned its back on what had happened behind those velvet-covered walls. Historians argued about how to describe him. Some said tyrant, others pervert. A few dared whisper the word monster, but none could deny what he had done to the city, not just to its people, but to its pride, its structure, its identity. For Rome had long believed it was built on discipline, valor, tradition, but Carinus had taken those pillars and turned them into playthings, dressing them in lace and setting them on fire for his pleasure. And in doing so, he exposed something that made Rome deeply uncomfortable, that its strength could be seduced, its laws ignored, its soldiers broken with nothing more than a smile and a lie. And when the city finally tried to erase him, to burn his paintings and scrape his name from every stone, it realized too late that the real damage had already been done. Not in the records, but in the people's memory. The women who had been taken from their husbands still carried the shame. The men who had knelt to him still carried the humiliation. And the children who had grown up watching him rule like a mad god still carried the fear, even if they didn't yet understand its shape. And so Rome entered a kind of silence, a cold season of shame, where no one dared speak his name, but everyone remembered it anyway. And every new emperor who followed walked carefully, spoke modestly, dressed plainly, not out of humility, but out of terror. For Carinus had shown them what power looked like when it lost all control, and no one wanted to be compared. The poets wrote cautionary tales, the priests gave sermons about moral decay, the Senate passed new laws about the sacredness of marriage and military honor, But none of it could erase the simple, awful truth that a boy in gold had once ruled them all, not with strength, but with seduction, not with wisdom, but with vanity, and that for a time they had let him, even cheered for him, even bowed to him. And that is what haunted them most, not what he did, but what they allowed. And in the darkest corners of taverns and bathhouses, old men still told the tale to wide-eyed youths, warning them of emperors with soft hands and sharp smiles, of palaces that shimmered with lust and ended in blood, of a man who wore 9 wedding rings and none with love, who called himself a god but lived like a curse. And though the official history said he had been erased, his shadow still moved through the city, through its whispers, its rumors, its guilt, and long after his name had been banned, after his statues had been broken, after even the generation who knew him had died off, there were still quiet moments when someone, somewhere, would glance over their shoulder and feel as if Carinus was watching. Not from heaven, not from hell, but from the space in between, where forgotten sins live, and where emperors who ruled with cruelty and pleasure never really die. Because Rome had many rulers, wise ones, strong ones, terrible ones, but only one who turned the empire into a mirror and made it flinch at its own reflection. And while his body burned away and his laws were thrown into the sea, the memory of Carinus stayed, not as a man, not as an emperor, but as a question that history still hasn't answered. What happens when power falls into the hands of someone who only wants to feed, to touch, to take, and never to lead? And what part of us lets him? If this story made you pause, if it left you unsettled, disturbed, or haunted by the face of power, twisted by pleasure, then don't let it end here. Like the video. Subscribe for more dark truths that history tried to bury, and share this with someone who thinks emperors were all glory and greatness. Because sometimes history doesn't wear a crown, it wears a mask, and sometimes it devours everything behind it.